Guys, okay, so I am filming this without knowing if I'm actually going to upload it or not. I guess it depends on how I feel when it's all done. I really liked the tag that Jessica from, what is it, the Storyteller Witch, who I just subscribed to because of this tag, which is Ducks for Decades. I love the idea, and she seems great. I've only seen that video, but when I have some time this week, I'm going to back up and try to watch some more of her stuff. It's funny, I watched Simon's response to this tag, and I realized that so many of us have been on a similar path. You know, we all kind of go through tragedies and things in our life that shape who we are. And even though the things that we go through may be different, we find ourselves on a similar path to a lot of different people. So I think that sharing our stories helps other people to realize that, well, realize for one that they can get through things that are tragic and hard to get through. And I know when I was going through my thing, which I'll be talking about tonight for probably the first time I think on my channel, it really, I remember thinking there is no one else that can be going through this. And I know that there are people out there. I've never met people who have been through what I went through, but I know there are people out there. And just the fact that people have gone through circumstances that were tragic helped me to realize I could get through it. And it made me who I am. And hearing Simon say, you know, I wouldn't change anything about my path. And with the exception maybe of one thing, I don't think I would change anything about my path either, because I would not be the person that I am without that path. I would be somebody else. Okay, so let me start the tag and then we'll go from there. I don't know if any of you will ever see this or not. We'll see. So the first decade, 0 to 10, this was really hard for me to choose a tarot deck because in my life I don't really remember very much before my teenage years. And I have little snippets of memories, and I believe that blocking out that period of time was my psyche's way of dealing with things that I didn't want to deal with or couldn't deal with. Which, and for this part of my life, it wasn't like a big tragic thing for me necessarily. What I ended up figuring out is that my father, I was raised by parents who were very, I always say I was raised by hippies. Both of my parents were pot smokers. Not that they acted like that. Now my father, if you ever met my father, you would know he acts very much like a hippie still today. My mother, on the other hand, is a nurse and was a business owner, and so you would probably be surprised to think that she smoked pot and was kind of a hippie. Apparently, when I was younger, and I'm still, I don't know, the timing, somewhere between 0 and 10, my father was arrested for selling cocaine. And in the United States, at that time, there was this big drug war going on, and it was a very, very big deal. He sold it to an undercover cop because a friend of his had gotten busted and turned him in, and it was a very long and like it was a big deal. apparently. Like I said, I don't have many memories. I remember the day he was arrested. I was swinging on the swings with my best friend. My mother told me to come in. We had lived in an apartment complex, and I could tell she had been crying, and I, of course, asked her what was wrong, and she told me that my father had been in a motorcycle accident. But that he was going to be okay or something. Like, she didn't leave it at that, like, he's in an accident. But she didn't want to tell me. I don't know how. I honestly don't remember how old I was. I think maybe 6 or I think I was in school anyways. Apparently the trial part of his trial lasted for like 8 years. Because they would go to trial and something would come up and they would throw stuff out, and it lasted a very long time, and the outcome of which he was, it landed in a mistrial, and they just finally let it go after like 10 years. And apparently we were in the courtroom sometimes and stuff. I have no memory of that whatsoever. I just have very few specific memories. I have, like I said, I have a memory of that day. Once in a while, if somebody brings up something, I kind of am like, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. I remember certain days, like at my grandparents' house. I remember summers we went to stay at my grandparents' cottage on the lake with my grandparents, and apparently that had something to do with the fact that Dad was going to trial a lot and stuff. But other than that, I don't have a whole lot of memories until I was a teenager. So the deck that I chose, because when I think of when I was a kid, the memories that I do have, I don't know, were like swinging on the swings and riding my bike. So I chose the Crystal Tarot by Phillip Permutt. He's a big crystal guy. Just because, like, the images in this deck, they're almost pippish, the minors. I'll show a couple. But the majors they remind me of like what a child would draw, kind of. They're very simple. And that, because I don't have a whole lot of memories from that time, I just tend to simplify that whole decade or decade and a half of my life. And I like this tarot. I have to say I don't use it very much. At some point, someday, with guidance, I think I would like to maybe do some hypnotherapy stuff or something, so maybe I can remember more of my childhood, because I don't think it was all bad. I just think that my brain decided I couldn't deal with that and decided to block it out. So that's what it did. So that is the deck that I chose for 0 to 10, which was in the 70s. I was born in 72. So that's the first deck. So then from 10 to 20, I kind of I was trying to think of, so my early teens, let's say, I chose the deck, the Lord of the Rings Tarot, because when I start to remember things, it was stuff that I did with my dad. My mom, what I remember of my mother from early childhood is that she worked a lot, and so when I saw her, a lot of times she was asleep on the couch, because she must have worked nights, and so she kind of slept on the couch. So my dad would do stuff with me and my brother. My brother is younger than me. And one of the things that we all loved to do was sci-fi and like Lord of the Rings stuff. This was before the big movies, the Lord of the Rings movies. but I went to, my father would take us out of school for the Star Wars premieres. I've been to every Star Wars premiere, except for the last one, on the date of the premiere, because it used to be they didn't have assigned seats in movie theaters, so you had to stand outside for hours. So I remember being a kid standing outside for hours with my dad, you know, talking to people in line and waiting to get into the theater to see a movie premiere. So we would see the premieres of stuff like Star Wars, Star Trek, the cartoon version of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So that was a lot of my early teens. And then my late teens, I was not a popular kid in school. I had a group of friends that I hung out with, and I would call myself, I was probably the leader of that group, and I don't know, I didn't do very well in school. I did drink and smoke pot. I think I was the leader of the group. We just hung out together. So I don't know. It was like a rocker thing. So I did not really have a tarot deck that I felt encompassed that. If I had to guess, I know there's a rock and roll tarot. I probably would have chose that if I had that. But I didn't really have one that to me said that. Maybe my book of Azazoth or something, because it was dark and I wore jeans constantly and concert t-shirts and that kind of thing. And then when I was 18, I met my husband, who was the bad boy. He was a drinker. And he was from the wrong side of the tracks, and his family grew up very different from mine. His father was an alcoholic and an abuser. Later in life, I found ways to incorporate him into our lives. And it's funny that I always feel like I have to justify that because I'm afraid that my husband will think I didn't like him. He was very close to his dad, even though he was the way he was. Yeah. So I was 18 when I met him. We moved to Florida like 3 months after we met, and tried to make a go of it down there, and we ended up leaving there and coming back after like 6 months, I think. And then I had broken up with him, and I found out I was pregnant. And so I called him to say, I think there's a possibility that I'm pregnant. Because I was 19, and the technical part of it is I got my period a couple times, I think, when I was pregnant, and then it was December and it was the holidays and stuff, so I didn't really realize it till March. And by the time I figured out that I was pretty sure I was pregnant, it was March, and I was almost 5 months pregnant before I knew. So he was overjoyed. I was terrified. He asked me to marry him, and he was so excited about it and so happy and just like overjoyed, and was gonna take care of things and all that. And I always loved my husband, and I don't know, I think I was terrified, and I loved him, but I think I was really terrified. So we ran away and eloped, which, because my family always hated him, and they didn't have any reason to like him. He was a bad boy. He was a drinker. He didn't have a job. You know. So my first son was born in August of 92, and 4 days later, my husband went to a party, and we had gotten into a fight about it when he left, because my son was 4 days old, and he wanted me to leave my son with his sister, I think. I can't really remember. Again, I kind of blocked some stuff out, but we got into a fight about it, and he decided to go to a party, and there was drinking, and there was a girl there who was drinking, and he ended up sleeping with that girl who ended up to be underage. And she got very scared because she had a boyfriend who was 18 or something, and all the details are not really necessary for this, but she accused him of forcible rape, and he denied anything. And the truth is somewhere in between. It's funny, I never asked for the truth to this day. My thought is that it was a consensual sexual act. We went through an entire trial. I got pregnant again in the middle of the trial. It was a huge, long, drawn-out process where he was facing 30 years in jail, and refused. He did not want to plea out. He did not want to accept a guilty plea. He ended up they said he was guilty of sleeping with a minor. And the day, let me think, no. They said he was guilty. The next day, I gave birth to our second son. And then it takes a couple months. A couple months later, he was sentenced to 6.5. No. He was sentenced to. See, my memory just does things. He ended up doing 6.5 years. So it was 6.5 to 12 or something like that, because they were making an example out of himself. As a matter of fact, out of him. As a matter of fact, at the sentencing hearing, the judge literally said, I don't care what the jury says, I think that you're guilty of the whole thing, and I'm going to press as many years on you as I can. So I had 2 babies, and I had just turned 20, and thank goodness I had a supportive family. My family supported the kids. My family did not support me at all. They wanted me to leave Peter every second. They would try to bribe me to leave him. They did all kinds of things to try to make me leave, and I would not. And to this day, I'm not sure. Again, I want to make it clear that I always loved my husband, always. He was stupid for a long time. He was a jerk for a long time, but I did always love him. And there was something in me that I needed the kids to know their father. So for 6.5 years, which brings me finally to my next deck. For 6.5 years, I had no life. I worked during the week, and on the weekends, every single weekend, I would pack 2 children up and drive usually between 2 and 4 hours to wherever Peter was in jail, because they kind of move you around so that the kids could see him. And so the deck that I chose for this point of my life is the Zombie Tarot, because I really feel like I was kind of a zombie. Like I said, I just did not have very much of a life. My life was working to pay as many bills as I could, and every single weekend, I did not take off one weekend. For 6.5 years, I packed the children up, drove them somewhere between 2 and 4 hours to go visit. And that is like a nightmare scenario. If you've ever had to visit anyone in jail, it is not fun. It is not easy. It is especially not easy with 2 kids in diapers and bottles and all kinds of things. So that, here, I'll show you some of the cards. I know this is really deep, and now I kind of feel bad. I bet you I'm not going to post this. You will never know. That ended 6.5 years later. He was finally released onto parole, and his end date was 15 years, which means he had to stay on parole for the remainder of the time until 15 years was up. And that means he was labeled as a felon, and actually labeled as a sex offender. It's the lowest level of sex offender, but it still means he was not allowed to go to the school. So when the kids had stuff, you know, soccer games or whatever, he was not allowed to do that. I had to do all of that. Shortly after he got out, shortly before he got out, I think 2 years before he got out, is when I had had enough, and I actually didn't talk to him for almost a year, like a calendar year. And in the meantime, I found a boyfriend who I thought was wonderful, and I thought loved me and the kids and all that. And he ended up to be a sexual predator who molested my older boys, both of my older boys. And the divorce went through. As soon as I found that out, I got rid of him. Actually, I got rid of him before I found that out, because what happened, the older boys were 3 and 4, and they started to cling to me when I was trying to leave for work and beg me not to leave. And even though this man acted like everything was wonderful and everything, I just didn't feel right, and I broke it off and told him to leave. And it wasn't until a week later, maybe 2 weeks later, that the kids came out and told me that. There's no way I'm posting this. I don't know why I'm continuing. Okay. Divorce court happened 2 weeks after I found out what had happened to the boys. And I won divorce court with no problem, because it was abandonment. At that time, you needed a reason to get a divorce, and Peter had been in prison. So there was no, it was abandonment, there was no question. The only thing that Peter got was I was required to tell him when medical or large occurrences happened in their life. And that thing, that counted. Because I had begged my lawyer to try to make it so I didn't have to tell him that. Because I just knew that he would turn around and make it because I had left and I had found somebody else and this is what happens. And so the day after divorce court, I went to visit him and sat down terrified to tell him. And in that year, he had found religion. He had been through a lot of his own things because no one visited him but me. And so when I didn't, he didn't have a visitor for a year. And he did just the opposite of what I thought he would do, which is he cried. He told me it wasn't my fault, that it was his fault for being there. He apologized up and down. It was completely the opposite. And we got back together that day. And I'm sure, looking back, I'm sure part of that was I knew what had happened when I tried to leave. That's always in the back of my head, like, did I really think it was going to work out? Or did I really think I was being punished for trying to leave? All I know is that the universe's timing is what it is. And I know that Peter was a completely different person. And at that point, we only had a couple years, not even. I think it was a little over a year, I think, before he did actually get out. Which brings us to the next deck. Oh, isn't this a lovely video? Okay, so the next deck, when Peter got out, we moved into this teeny tiny little town in the middle of the woods. We had 5.5 acres. We were the only house that lived there year round on our dirt road, which was a mile long. We were right dead in the middle of it. And we lived in the boondocks. We lived in the country. There was one school for K through 12. And we lived there with the boys for 5 or 6 years, I think. So the deck that I chose is Earth Magic. Just because it was a good time in my life. Just nature. This is really, I just dropped a card too. Nope, it totally disappeared. Really? Okay, oh, here it is. This is where I developed my love for nature. Was in this beautiful land that we had. The only problem with living way out in the boondocks is you're way out in the boondocks. There's nothing. We had one store that closed at 6 o'clock at night, so if you needed groceries after 6 o'clock at night, you had to drive 45 minutes to the nearest, Tops to get your groceries. It was hard to find work because there was only so many things in this little town. And so after 5 years, I actually, no, after 7 years. So I chose 2 decks for this because that was the first one because we lived out in the boonies. And the second one was the Panda Tarot, which I chose because at this time in my life, I really threw myself into my children. And made their lives as best as I felt I could make it. They got to go outside like we did when we were kids, like from morning until night. They got to play outside. I didn't have to worry about, was somebody going to come and take them? Was somebody going to shoot them? Because we were in the boonies. The only thing I did have to worry about was like wild animals. But once you teach your children how to recognize that there's a wild animal about, they're smart enough to figure it out. They know. So this was a very nice, happy time in my life. Other than we were poor, but the kids didn't really know that. You know, we always had enough to eat. We didn't have a whole lot of luxury stuff, but they played outside a lot. We all did. So it was kind of a very nice time in life. Intellectually, it was kind of hard for me though. So while we were living there, I saw an ad in the paper, actually, is how it started. And I started X-ray school. When I was 28, I'm pregnant with my 4th boy. In between, I had my 3rd, like 9 months after Peter got out. And then I was pregnant when I was 28 for my last son. And I started X-ray school. So the next one I picked was the Antique Anatomy. This deck brings me back to my X-ray roots. I can name every single bone. So to me, I just love this deck and the Oracle decks that go with it. Which of course I cannot think of right now. Oracle of the Oddities. And there's 3 versions and I have all 3. So I love this deck because it does take me back to my X-ray roots. This was very intellectually stimulating. It was something that I had never come into contact before anything like that. I had to learn physics to learn how the X-ray actually worked. It's stuff that you don't come into contact with, like I said, unless you're doing that. I learned CAT scan, I learned X-ray, and later on I learned mammography, which is what I do now. So that brings me to about my mid-30s. And we moved from this rural area to a less rural area, Watkins Glen, New York. Which I loved. I loved our house in Watkins Glen. I loved my job. That's not true. I loved my job. I loved what I did. I hated the bosses that I worked for. They were horrible, and that's a whole nother story. But the job itself was wonderful. I became a pagan at this time in my early 30s and started exploring sacred feminine stuff and nature and goddess work and shadow work, and my kids were great. Sacred Rebel. So that's the deck that I chose for that. That was really the beginning of my